hard to understand at first, but it really isn't. It's just another supply and demand model. And so this supply and demand model really shows us the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds being traded and the real interest rate. And so let's take a look here. And so we have, instead of having price here, we have the real interest rate. And over here on the x-axis, we have, instead of quantity of goods, we have quantity of loanable funds. And then everything else is basically the same. We have a demand curve for loanable funds given by, how much money is being asked for in terms of loans. And we have this negative relationship between the real interest and the demand curve because the interest rate can be thought of as like the expensiveness of a loan, right? So demand for loanable funds is basically the demand. You can think about it as, if I want to take out a loan, then I'm contributing to the demand of loanable funds. And you aggregate all the demand for loanable funds, and that gives you the demand curve. And the reason we have this negative relationship between real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds demanded is because if interest rates are high, that is going to decrease the incentive for people to take out loans, because it means that they have to return the loans they take out at higher rates, and that's bad. And so if we have high interest rates over here, we're going to have low quantity of funds demanded. On the flip side, we see that if real interest rates decrease and they're low, then the quantity of loanable funds demand is going to be high. And that's actually something we see right now, where with the interest rates being really low, with the Fed setting interest rates really low, that's basically stimulating people to borrow more and trying to stimulate the economy. We want people to borrow and invest and build things and be productive. And that's given when you have a low interest rate and you promise there to be low interest kind of charges on these loans. And on the other hand, we have the supply curve. This is again the supply curve for loanable funds, and that's given by the willingness of people to provide funds and loan them out to other people. So we can think about this as savings. So something as simple as putting money into a bank, you're essentially supplying money for loanable funds because you're not using it and you're allowing the bank to loan out that money. And so the question is, what is the relationship between how much I'm willing to put in my bank account and how much real interest rate is? And the answer is, you can think of when you open a savings account, you look at the interest rate that you earn on that savings account, and if the interest rate were high, you'd be more willing to put more money into your savings account because you know that the return on those savings is going to be higher. On the other hand, if you have like a quarter of a percentage of interest being earned on your savings account, there's really less motivation for you to put that money into savings because you could just spend it right now, and you don't forgo the opportunity of earning more interest payments in the future. And so that's going to be that kind of dynamic which explains the upward slope of supply curve. And putting that all together, we get an equilibrium, right? We get an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, and we get an equilibrium interest rate of what the interest rate would be. And so just like any supply and demand model, this should be kind of the equilibrium point that we see in the loanable funds market. Okay, so now that we understand the setup for the loanable funds market, the question is which of these answer choices is true. So the first thing we have to note is the question gives us a scenario of a shortage of loanable funds, where we have to understand what that means. So for there to be a shortage, it means there are too many people who want loans and not enough people to provide the loans. And therefore, we're going to see something less, a real interest rate less than the equilibrium interest rate, where there's some sort of gap right here, right? Oh, that's a bad line. Let's try that one more time. And so this gap given over here, that is our shortage, right? We have this much quantity being demanded in the market for loanable funds, and we only have this much quantity being supplied by lenders. And so that is our shortage. And so which one of these answer choices is going to actually describe the situation the best? The quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied. That is true. And so it's looking good so far. And it says the interest rate is above equilibrium. And that's where it's wrong, right? We see here that the interest rate is clearly below the equilibrium interest rate over here. And so we're not going to be dealing with that as the right answer. B says the quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied, and the interest rate is below equilibrium. And I think that captures it perfectly. We have demand is greater than supply, and we also have interest rate is below equilibrium. Let's just take a look at the other ones to make sure. It says the quantity of loanable funds supplied is greater than the quantity of loanable funds demanded, and so does D, and we know that's not the case. That is what we would call a surplus, which would be up here, right? And that's not something that we deal with. And so again, the idea of a shortage and a surplus in the loanable funds market is the exact same as the idea of a shortage or surplus in a conventional supply and demand market model. And so just understanding that and not getting too scared by the loanable funds market or loanable funds model is going to keep it pretty easy to understand here. Okay, so now we understand what the right answer is. Why don't we take a look at the next question? The answer choice. So it says option B is correct, and that's true. The quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied, and the interest rate is below equilibrium. The quantity demanded of loanable funds are investments, and the quantity supplied of loanable funds are savings of a country. And yes, that's correct. If there's a shortage of loanable funds, that will mean that quantities demanded investments are greater than quantity supplied, right? Thus, when savings is less than investment, that will create a shortage of loanable funds in the market, and the interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level. And so the only issue here is that it just says that interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level, and we can provide a slight explanation for that. And so interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level, because a shortage on the loanable funds graph by definition demands a real interest rate less than the equilibrium. From a theory standpoint, an interest rate that is too low causes there to be a unordinarily high demand for investments because the cost of taking out a loan is cheap. Meanwhile, that low interest rate causes there to be an unordinarily low supply of savings because there is less return on money placed into savings. These two factors contribute to the shortage. Right, and so let's see what all these little, what did I spell wrong here? I guess unordinarily is not a word. Let's be an inefficiently high demand, inefficiently low supply. Loanable funds, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. And so this is going to give a little bit more clarity because I think the answer choice really hit the nail on the head when it was talking about, which is greater quantity demand or quantity supply, but it doesn't really explain why interest rate is necessarily lower than equilibrium, and that's the difference between A and B. And so hopefully this answer choice talking about both the loanable funds graph that they can look up and also the factors contributing to, the actual relationship between interest rate and supply and demand is going to cause there to be more of a understanding of the actual model and